They said Elias Whitmore was always a quiet child, but after his mother's burial, he stopped speaking entirely. He watched the world like it was behind glass, and some nights the glass watched back. In the parlor of the Whitmore house stood a tall silver mirror, older than the floor it stood on, colder than any breath. And when Elias passed it, his reflection lingered too long, smiled too wide, moved too early. In 1856, Georgia, the soil is thick with secrets, and sometimes the mirror remembers what the living try to forget. The first time it happened, no one believed her. Aunt Miriam had risen early, the sun not yet melting the mist off the fields, and made her way to the parlor for her morning tea. The house was quiet, that heavy, southern silence that blankets wood and bone alike. She passed the tall mirror near the foyer, intending only to glance at her shawl, but paused. Elias was already there. The boy stood still, barefoot on the cool floorboards, eyes locked with his reflection. His hands were limp at his sides. But in the glass, his reflection smiled. Miriam's breath caught, a quiet rasp swallowed by the house. Elias didn't smile, didn't move. And yet, the boy in the mirror grinned with a kind of knowing broad and wrong. "Elias," she whispered, as if the sound might scare the moment away. He blinked then, slow and empty, and turned to her. No smile, no recognition, just that same hollow stare he'd worn since the funeral. Miriam told the others over supper, voice low as the flickering oil lamp. Elias's father, Thomas, waved her off with tired eyes and bourbon breath. "He's grieving," he said. "We all see strange things when grief comes knocking." But Miriam wasn't grieving, not like Elias, not like the boy who'd been found curled in the tall grass after his mother drowned in the well, and not like whatever it was that smiled from the other side of the glass. That night, when the house creaked into darkness, Miriam crept down the hall with a linen sheet in hand. She would cover the mirror, just until morning, just until her nerves steadied. But as she reached for the frame, her fingers trembled. The mirror was colder than it should have been, like ice pulled from a grave, and in the silver reflection, she saw her own hand hesitate. She saw Elias behind her, smiling, but when she turned, he wasn't there. Just the hallway, empty and quiet, with a chill that ran straight to her marrow. The sheet never made it onto the glass. She left it crumpled at the foot of the mirror, like an offering, like surrender. Upstairs, Elias slept or pretended to, and in the mirror, the boy kept smiling. The Whitmore house had no curtains. Not in the parlor, not in the bedrooms, not even in the nursery where sunlight spilled in so bright it bleached the wallpaper. Neighbors said it was unnatural, a house that never blinked. Windows are the eyes of the soul, they'd mutter at church, fanning themselves while casting sideways glances at Thomas Whitmore and the mute boy who clung to his shadow. But Thomas would only nod with that distant smile of his and say, "We've got nothing to hide." What he didn't say was that his wife had begged for curtains every spring, her voice trembling whenever she passed the mirror near the stairs. She'd hated how it always caught her reflection, even in the dark. Hated how the glass never seemed dusty, never fogged, never changed. After her death, Thomas had all the curtains taken down, said it was for light, said mourning should never be done in the dark. But light only made it worse. Light revealed the smudges that couldn't be wiped off the mirror, the faint handprints too small to be Thomas's, too slender to be Elias's. At night, when the house sighed and settled, the panes of glass seemed to shimmer, not with moonlight, but with something underneath it, like light filtering through water. Miriam noticed first. Standing by the staircase with a candle, she saw her own reflection in the window, but the flame in her hand was blue, not gold. She blinked. So did the reflection. A beat too late. Outside, the wind was still. The trees didn't rustle, but the window creaked faintly, as if something on the other side had leaned in close. She didn't tell Thomas. She didn't tell the pastor either. What would she say? That the house was watching them? That it felt like someone else was living behind the glass, pacing just out of sight? Instead, she told the maid to scrub the windows again, though they were already clean. The maid did so in silence, her hands trembling, the bucket of water sloshing like something alive. Elias watched from the hallway, his eyes too old for his age. He did not blink. He hadn't blinked in days. When Miriam asked if he wanted to go outside, to play in the orchard, he only tilted his head like he was listening for something she couldn't hear. The windows around them caught their shapes, long and warped by the afternoon light. But in one pane, for the briefest moment, Elias's reflection lifted its hand. He did not. The hand stayed raised, fingers twitching like a wave. Then it vanished. The boy never moved. Miriam told herself it was light, just sorrow bending the world. But that night, before bed, she walked through the house with a candle and laid a sheet over the mirror anyway. She told herself it was to keep the dust off, but the truth sat heavy behind her ribs. The house had no curtains, because some things should never be covered. Elias used to speak in riddles, soft questions at supper like, "Where does the moon go when it's afraid?" Or, "Why do shadows breathe?" His mother would laugh and answer with nursery rhymes, her hands always brushing through his curls, her voice wrapping around him like a hymn. But after she drowned, his mouth sealed like a door closed from the inside. No tears, no tantrums, just silence, the kind that sits wrong in a child. At first, Thomas said it was a phase. "The boy's in mourning," he told Miriam, who had started keeping a journal of things she could not explain. "He'll find his voice again." But the weeks passed, and Elias did not speak. Not to the maid who sang while folding sheets, not to the stable hand who offered him a coin, not even to the stray cat that had begun to sleep near his window. His voice, once soft and strange, had vanished like breath on a cold mirror, and the silence spread. The birds no longer perched on the roof at sunrise. The bees had stopped humming near the honeysuckle vines. Even the crickets, once loud beneath the floorboards, now chirped with hesitation, as though something unseen was listening for them. One morning, Miriam found Elias standing in the hallway in front of the mirror. The sheet she draped over it was gone, folded neatly on the floor beside his feet. His eyes stared into the glass, not at his own face, but deeper, as if looking through it. She called his name. He didn't flinch. She reached out to touch his shoulder. In the mirror, his reflection flinched before she touched him. But Elias didn't. Miriam recoiled, breath caught in her throat, and whispered a prayer under her breath. Elias turned to her slowly, eyes dull and distant, and walked away without a sound. That afternoon, she begged Thomas to bring in the preacher. "He needs help," she said, her voice low, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. Spiritual help. But Thomas only rubbed his temples and muttered something about madness and gossip. "You think folks won't talk if a reverend comes knocking?" He snapped. "They already call this house cursed." Miriam didn't care. She cared about the way Elias sat now, always facing the mirror, always quiet, his lips occasionally twitching like he was mouthing words he could not say or wouldn't. Words meant for someone else. Words meant for something else. That night, she left a bowl of milk outside Elias's door like folks used to do for spirits. She didn't believe in such things. Not really. But when she checked in the morning, the bowl was empty. The boy hadn't touched it. He was still asleep in bed, stiff as a doll, mouth slightly parted like he was whispering in his dreams. And on the mirror downstairs, a single handprint had appeared in the center of the glass. Small, thin, pressed from the inside. The mirror hadn't always been in the Whitmore house. Miriam was certain of that now, though no one else seemed to remember a time before it. It stood too tall for the space it filled, its silver frame etched with thorned vines and curling leaves that shimmered even in the dark. It looked like it belonged to another century, something plucked from an old cathedral or a crypt. Miriam asked Thomas one evening, casually, as they shelled peas on the porch, "Where did the mirror come from?" He didn't look up. "It was a wedding gift," he said. "From her side. Charleston, I think. Some distant cousin with too much money and not enough manners." She watched him for a long moment, waiting for more, but he only kept shelling peas, one after the other, like the memory held no weight. But Miriam remembered. She remembered the day it arrived. Heavy as sin, carted in by two men who wouldn't step over the threshold. They'd left it on the porch, wrapped in dusty velvet, muttering something about how it didn't belong in a house with children. That had been the day Elias was born. His mother, still in labor upstairs, her screams soaked into the floorboards. The house, too, still like it was holding its breath. They'd brought the mirror inside before he took his first breath, and by the time his cries echoed down the staircase, the mirror had already been hung on the foyer wall. Miriam hadn't thought of it then. Not when death was still far away, and the world hadn't turned strange. But now it felt like a hinge, a thing that opened something. That night she climbed into the attic with a lantern, dust stirring in the beam like ash. Boxes of old linens, rusted trunks, books with damp-spotted pages, and in the far corner, behind a cracked cradle, she found the crate the mirror had come in, still marked with the shipping wax, still lined with the velvet cloth. The name scrawled across the top made her breath catch. W. Pembroke. Charleston. She recognized the name from the letter she wasn't meant to read, the one Thomas burned when his wife died. The cousin who died childless, whose house had been sealed shut after a string of misfortunes. 5 sons born, 5 sons dead. All before the age of 10, all buried without faces. Miriam shut the crate and climbed down in silence. She didn't tell Thomas. She didn't tell the maid. But she began to notice things after that. The way Elias's shadow sometimes split near the mirror. The way the reflection's lips moved when no one else was speaking. And how every time she passed the silver frame, she felt her heart skip like it was trying to get ahead of something coming. Something that remembered. Something that arrived the same day Elias did. Bess was the oldest servant in the house. Her hands were knotted with age, her back curved like a question mark, but her eyes were sharp as ever. She'd been with the Whitmores since before Thomas was born and remembered things no one else did or wanted to. She never liked the mirror, called it the mouth, said it opened more than it showed. The younger maids laughed and rolled their eyes, but Bess kept a bundle of dried sage under her apron and spat on the floor every time she passed it. One morning, after finding Elias sitting in front of the glass again, lips twitching like he was answering questions no one had asked, Bess had enough. She muttered something in a language no one recognized, crossed herself 3 times, and fetched a bolt of black cloth from the linen chest. Miriam was in the garden when she heard the crash. It wasn't the loud kind that breaks things, it was the soft, sick kind. The sound of knees hitting wood. She rushed inside and found Bess on the floor in front of the mirror, her eyes wide and unfocused, mouth slack with something like awe or terror. The cloth lay beside her, untouched. Her lips moved, just barely, repeating a phrase over and over. It grinned first. It grinned first. It grinned first. Miriam pulled her away, tried to lift her, but Bess screamed a dry, broken sound that rattled the walls. Elias came downstairs, silent as ever, and stood at the landing. He watched them from above, face unreadable. The mirror behind Bess gleamed with unnatural clarity, though no light touched it. That night, Bess refused to sleep indoors. She built a fire out near the barn and muttered through the dark, her eyes never leaving the house. The next morning, she was gone, the sheets on her cot untouched, her apron folded neatly on the hearth. The only sign of her was a small pile of salt, poured in a perfect circle where she used to sleep. Thomas said she was old, that old folks wandered off sometimes, especially if the mind started to slip. But Miriam didn't believe that. Neither did the horses, who refused to go near the barn for 2 days after. Neither did the cook, who found her knives all turned upside down in the drawer. And neither did Elias, who stood at the mirror that evening, one hand pressed flat against the glass. His palm left no print, but something on the other side did. 5 fingers, small and dark, pushing outward from within. Not a handprint. A hand, as if waiting to be pulled through, as if Bess had been right, and the mirror was not a thing that showed. It was a thing that opened. And whatever grinned first was still grinning. The house had grown too quiet, and Elias had grown too still. He no longer wandered the orchard or sat on the porch with his sketchbook. Instead, he spent his days near the mirror, not always standing before it, but always within its reach, close enough that his reflection remained somewhere behind him, watching. One afternoon, Miriam caught him alone, the parlor dim with rainlight, the mirror half covered in shadows. Elias stood in front of it, feet bare, his small hands hanging at his sides. His lips were parted, just slightly, and his eyes were unfocused, as if listening to something deep in the glass. Then came the smile. It spread across his face, slow and unnatural, not playful or shy, but deliberate as if rehearsed. But it wasn't his own doing. Miriam saw it clearly. Elias's face didn't move, not the real one. Only the reflection smiled. First slow, then wider, and then wider still, until the corners strained into something grotesque. The child before her stood frozen, but his mirrored twin beamed like he'd been promised something, the kind of smile a person wears just before a secret is told. She stepped forward, voice caught in her throat. The moment she called his name, Elias blinked. The smile disappeared. His reflection caught up, falling back into perfect mimicry, and he turned to her as if nothing had happened. That evening, she asked the cook when Elias had last eaten. Not since the rain started, came the answer. 2 days, maybe 3, and yet the boy hadn't faded. His cheeks were still pink, his hands still warm. It was as if something else was feeding him now. Something from behind the glass. Miriam sat him down in the kitchen and placed a slice of peach pie in front of him. His eyes flicked to the surface of the pie tin, where a soft, warbled reflection of his face stared back. He smiled then. Brief, small, but it came too fast. The smile had already been there before he made it. She saw it, swore she saw it. She snatched the pie away and sent him to bed. That night, she took a needle and pricked her thumb in front of the mirror. One drop of blood fell to the floor, but in the glass, her hand didn't move. The reflection stood still, eyes locked with hers. The smile returned, not hers, and then the head tilted, like a child admiring a game. The mirror had grown bolder. Elias no longer needed to smile. The thing in the glass would do it for him. Practice for a face it planned to wear. Practice for a world it planned to step into. And in that flickering moment, Miriam realized something she hadn't dared admit until now. Elias wasn't watching the mirror. The mirror was watching him, teaching him, grooming him, one smile at a time. The morning of Elias's birthday came and went, like a breath held too long. There was no cake, though the cook swore she'd left the batter rising on the windowsill. No candles, though Miriam remembered buying them from the traveling peddler 2 weeks prior. No ribbons or wrapped parcels. Even the clock in the parlor, usually punctual as a bell tower, skipped the chime at noon. It was as if the day had slid sideways, skipped over like a scratched phonograph. Thomas didn't seem to notice. He sat on the porch, nursing a bottle of rye, muttering that time moved differently now, that the air felt thicker every year, that some days didn't need remembering. But Miriam remembered. She always had. She had watched Elias come into the world screaming, watched his mother's blood spill across the bedsheets, watched the mirror downstairs, catch the reflection of that moment, and seem to hold it too clearly, too long. Elias, on the other hand, didn't seem to care that the day was his. He woke at dawn and dressed himself, wandered down the stairs without a word, and sat across from the mirror like he was waiting for someone to arrive. Miriam baked a new pie, peach again, and placed it on the table in front of him, but he didn't touch it. He only watched the mirror, and the boy inside the glass watched him back. The reflection wore a crooked paper crown that Elias did not. Its smile came early again, wider than ever, twitching at the corners with something almost hungry. Miriam's skin prickled. She turned her back to fetch a knife, and when she turned again, the pie was gone. The tin sat empty. Elias hadn't moved, not an inch. That night, Miriam rifled through the hall closet in search of the old family Bible, thinking perhaps she might find his baptism date, some thread of truth to prove the boy still belonged to this world. But the pages were blank where his name should have been, blank or erased. Ink ghosts shimmered faintly beneath candlelight, too faded to read, but too deliberate to be accidental. In the parlor, The mirror hummed, not in sound, but in presence, as if its very surface pulsed faintly with breath. Elias stood before it again, his head tilted slightly to one side, both hands clasped behind his back like a schoolboy reciting lessons. Miriam watched from the doorway. The boy inside the glass still wore the crown. The real Elias did not. The boy, inside the glass, blew out candles that weren't there. The real Elias didn't blink, and when midnight passed, the wind didn't stir. The crickets didn't sing. The day had been eaten, swallowed whole. Somewhere deep in the house, the mirror sighed, and in that silence, Miriam felt something shift, like the world had turned a page, but the story had stayed the same. It was just a scrape. Elias had tripped near the garden path, one bare foot catching on the jagged edge of a root, and fell onto the loose gravel, with a sound like dry corn husks tearing. Miriam ran to him, lifting him gently by the arms, brushing dirt from his knees. A thin red line bloomed across his left leg, shallow but sharp, beating blood in a slow, deliberate trail. Elias didn't cry. He didn't wince. He only looked down at the wound with a strange, flat curiosity, then looked up at her and whispered, "It's not where it should be." She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. It was the first thing he'd said aloud in weeks. He repeated it once more, softer this time, almost to himself, then stood without help and limped back toward the house. Inside, Miriam fetched the salve and linen bandages, determined to tend to the wound before Thomas returned. She found Elias in the parlor, standing barefoot once again before the mirror. His trousers were rolled to the knee, exposing the scrape, but something was wrong. In the glass, the wound bled from the opposite leg, the right, not the left. At first, she thought it a trick of the light. She circled around, checked again, still the same. The boy in the mirror bled from the wrong side. And he was smiling, a faint, glimmering smile, pressed tight at the edges, as if pleased with the error. Miriam reached for Elias's leg, pressing the cloth to the cut, but her hands trembled. She looked up once more at the mirror and saw something that froze her breath in her chest. The reflection did not move, not with her, not with Elias. It stood still, as if watching a performance through glass. The smile never faltered, the blood ran a little faster, and when she lifted the cloth, the real Elias was already healed. Smooth skin, pink and unbroken, no scab, no pain, no memory. "It wasn't supposed to stay," he said, voice low. He took it. Miriam jerked her head toward him, but he was already walking away, quiet as fog. That night, she dreamt of Elias standing in the mirror's world, his left leg bleeding freely, the other boy watching with glee, hands stained crimson. When she woke, she found her own knees aching, her bedsheets damp with something metallic. Downstairs, the mirror sat clean and empty, showing only the room behind her, but she swore she heard breathing, as if someone on the other side had finally caught the scent of the world beyond the glass, and was hungry for more. The next morning, Miriam laid out a spoon, a bowl of porridge, and a linen napkin at the breakfast table, careful in her quiet movements. Elias wandered in, just as the sun cracked through the shutters, its light falling in long gold ribbons across the floor. He moved to sit in his usual chair, but paused, his eyes drifting, not to the food, but to the mirror on the far wall, where it caught the soft morning light like a waiting eye. Without a word, he reached for the spoon, but something about the gesture was off. Miriam watched closely. He reached with his left hand. Elias was right-handed. She was sure of it. She had taught him to write his name with his right hand, to hold a knife, to hold a pencil. The boy's motions had always been quick and clumsy, in that hand awkward but familiar. And yet here he was, stirring his porridge with his left, smooth and fluid, like he had always done it. Across the room, the mirror showed the reflection of the same motion, but it was the right hand moving. The reflection matched what should have been, not what was. Miriam felt the hair on her arms rise. Her breath caught behind her teeth. "Elias," she said carefully, "can you show me how you tie your shoes?" He looked up, blinking once, then pushed back from the table. He knelt down by his boots, fingers working the laces, with practiced ease again with the left. But in the mirror, the boy used the right. Miriam stepped closer, one hand gripping the back of a dining chair. Her eyes flicked between the real Elias and his mirrored twin, the latter now beginning to grin, not with lips, but with eyes, as if pleased by the dissonance. "You're not my boy," Miriam whispered. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but it was out before she could swallow it. Elias looked up at her, then not angry, not sad, just puzzled. "He's learning," he said softly. "He's getting better at being me." The room shifted, like the air had thickened. She glanced at the mirror again and saw, to her horror, that the reflection now moved faster, tied the laces quicker, smiled broader. There was no porridge in front of that boy, no sunbeams catching his curls, just stillness and cold, and a face learning to wear someone else's. Miriam backed away, heart drumming in her ears. The mirror did not blur or distort. It only watched, faithful and clear. Elias sat back in his chair, calm as ever. But the image in the mirror lingered just a beat too long, holding its gaze after the real boy looked away. That evening, Miriam locked the dining room door from the outside. She didn't want to see the mirror in the dark. She didn't want to find out which hand the boy would use next. The fog came in thick that morning, rolling off the fields like a slow spill of milk. It clung to the windows, pressed against the glass like a breath held too long. Miriam lit the lanterns early, but the light seemed to push only inches into the gray. She moved room to room with a cloth in hand, wiping the window panes out of habit more than need. The moisture didn't come from rain. It came from somewhere closer, like the air inside had started to sweat. As she scrubbed the glass in Elias's room, her sleeve caught a smudge she hadn't seen before. A handprint, small, perfect, pressed to the inside of the glass. She stared at it, her own breath fogging just beneath it, and slowly raised her palm to compare. Elias's hands were bigger now. This one belonged to a younger child, maybe a child who hadn't grown, who hadn't left, maybe a child who had never been born at all. Downstairs, she found more of them. Smudges on the dining room window, a partial thumbprint on the hallway mirror. On the glass face of the parlor clock, she saw the faint outline of a message. The letters were crooked, as if drawn by a child's finger. 3 words, nothing more. "I was first." The cloth slipped from her hand. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She reached for the mirror, not daring to touch it, but needing to see. The reflection was wrong. The hallway behind her looked stretched, darker than it should be, like a corridor receding into a place the house didn't have. And standing at the far end was Elias, or something that wore his shape. Too still, too clean. The clothes didn't match. He wore old-fashioned breeches and a buttoned shirt too tight at the collar, like something from a portrait. His smile glimmered, sharp at the edges, almost proud. Then he blinked. The mirror returned to normal. Just a hallway, just her own frightened face, just the ordinary air. She staggered back. The letters on the fogged window had already faded. She checked Elias's room. He was gone. She called for him through the house, each room more silent than the last. She finally found him in the attic, sitting cross-legged on the floor, tracing shapes in the dust with one finger. When she asked what he was doing, he didn't look up. "I was drawing the other boy," he said, "the one from the mirror." Miriam knelt beside him, her mouth dry. "What other boy?" Elias looked at her then, blank and matter-of-fact. "The first one, the one I was copied from." Then he returned to his drawing, and Miriam looked down at the shapes in the dust, spirals, teeth, and something like a door. Not a doorway, a door, shut tight, scratched all over. From the inside, Dr. Riving came on a Thursday, arriving just after the fog had lifted and the sun returned, pale and indifferent. He stepped down from his carriage with a leather bag in hand and a kerchief tight around his neck, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. Thomas had called him weeks ago, back when Elias had first stopped speaking, but the doctor had been delayed by the fever sweeping through the next county. Now that he stood on the Whitmore porch, he looked up at the house as if it might bite. "Old places hold old things," he muttered to Miriam as she led him in. "Sometimes grief, sometimes worse." He examined Elias in the parlor, the boy sitting stiff-backed in the same chair he always chose, close enough for the mirror to catch his outline. Dr. Riving asked questions. Do you sleep well, Elias? Do you dream? Do you miss your mother? Elias said nothing, only blinked slowly and folded his hands in his lap. The doctor checked his eyes, his pulse, his temperature. All normal. All fine, but something in his face shifted when he looked into the boy's pupils. Something distant, like a curtain pulling back on something he wasn't meant to see. Does he often stare at the mirror? The doctor asked, his voice quieter now. Miriam nodded. Too often. Dr. Riving stepped toward the glass, slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal. His reflection met him immediately. Same posture, same suit, same gray streak at the temple, but after a moment, Miriam saw the color drain from his face. What do you see? She asked. Myself, he said. Only not quite. He leaned in, just inches from the glass. My hands are folded wrong. Miriam followed his gaze. The reflection was reversed, yes, but beyond that, his fingers were mismatched. In the real world, he'd clasped left over right. In the mirror, it was right over left, not mirrored, just different. It's like it knows how to copy, he said, breath catching, but not what it means. Then he froze, his eyes locked on something over Miriam's shoulder. Slowly, she turned. No one was there. But in the mirror, Elias stood just behind her, smiling with a stillness that didn't belong to any child. Dr. Riving stepped back so fast, he nearly tripped over the rug. Whatever is in that mirror, he said, grabbing his bag, it's not a reflection, it's a rehearsal. He refused tea, refused supper, and when he reached the front door, he turned back to Miriam one last time. Burn it, he said, or bury it in salt and forget this house ever had glass. Then he was gone, carriage wheels rattling down the drive. Upstairs, Elias hummed to himself in his room, drawing in the dust. Downstairs, the mirror stood untouched, and within its frame, the doctor's reflection lingered just a moment longer, still staring, still wrong. Aunt Miriam had never been one for dramatics. She'd survived yellow fever, 2 bad harvests, and the drowning of her sister-in-law without once fainting. But when she saw the reflection in the mirror that Sunday morning, her knees buckled like rotted wood. Elias had come down for church, dressed in his best pressed trousers, polished shoes, his collar buttoned too tight. He looked pale, but not sick. Strange, but not unfamiliar. Miriam was pinning her hair in the hallway when she caught sight of him in the mirror behind her. At first, it seemed normal. The boy stood still, arms at his sides, head slightly tilted. But then she saw the smile. Not a child's smile. Not a real one. It started small, then widened and widened still, until it reached a place no face should go. The mouth stretched past the cheeks, the skin pulling like wax under heat. And then she saw the teeth. Not just too many, too sharp. Tiny, glinting things, packed tight, like something that chewed through more than food. The reflection blinked. Elias did not. She gasped, one hand flying to her chest, and stumbled backward. Her shoulder hit the doorframe, and she sank to the floor. Elias turned to her, calm and curious, the way a child might look at a fallen doll. You saw it, he said, voice flat. You saw what he really looks like. Miriam could not speak. Her tongue felt thick, useless. Her fingers trembled in her lap. The boy stepped forward, and the real sound of his shoes on the wood gave her no comfort. He's practicing, Elias whispered. He's almost ready. Then he walked past her, heading toward the chapel carriage outside. Miriam forced herself up. Her breath rasped in her throat like wind through broken glass. She looked once more at the mirror. The boy was gone. No reflection, just the hallway, empty behind her, and the faintest smear of something reddish at the edge of the frame, like a fingerprint made in rust. She wiped it with her sleeve. It didn't budge. That evening, Miriam refused supper. She lit every oil lamp in the house and sat across from the mirror with her Bible in hand. But the words on the page blurred. The reflection smiled once, Just once. Not Elias. Not quite. She didn't faint again. But she didn't sleep either. The next morning, she drew every curtain in the house for the first time in years. Thomas yelled, said the house would turn to shadow, said she was stirring up fear. But she didn't care. She had seen too many teeth in a boy who should not have them. And some smiles, once seen, never left the mind. They sat there behind your eyelids, grinning, waiting. The attic hadn't been opened in months, maybe longer. Dust lay thick as velvet on the floorboards, and the air held the scent of forgotten things, cedar, candle wax, and old sorrow. Miriam brought a lantern and a scarf tied tight around her nose, though nothing could keep out the chill that greeted her at the top of the stairs. Not a cold draft, but a stillness too old to be natural. She wasn't sure what led her there that morning. Maybe it was the way Elias had smiled at the breakfast table. Too easily, too quickly, like the reflection had gotten ahead of him again. Or maybe it was the thudding sound she'd heard at midnight. One single knock, like a fist against glass, like a boy asking to come in. The trunks in the attic were lined with lace and moth-eaten clothes, old photographs turned yellow with time. But in the far corner, half buried under a sheet of rotting canvas, was a ledger. She recognized the handwriting on the first page. Thomas's mother, neat and straight like a schoolteacher. But it wasn't a journal, it was a record. A list of items gifted to the Whitmores on the occasion of Thomas's wedding. Miriam flipped through pages, china sets, candlesticks, pewter flatware. And then, in bold black ink, a single line set apart from the others. One Venetian mirror, silver-backed, from W. Pembroke Estate, Charleston. No thank you note had been sent, no signature beside it. Just a blank space, like the mirror had arrived on its own. She turned the page. There was a letter folded inside, sealed, then torn, then tucked away in shame. The handwriting was Thomas's, but the words weren't addressed to family. They were a plea. Do not keep it near the child. It does not belong in daylight. I tried to return it, but the glass won't crack and the house won't let it leave. I believe something watches through it. Something older than mirrors. The date was the day after Elias was born. Miriam dropped the paper. Her hands were shaking now. In the corner of the attic, a full-length mirror leaned against the wall, covered in a faded bedsheet. Not the one from the parlor. A second mirror, hidden. She stepped toward it, but the lantern flickered. The flame bent backward, like wind blew from inside the glass. She froze. A shape stirred beneath the sheet, soft, like breathing. She didn't lift the cover. She couldn't. Instead, she backed down the stairs, one trembling step at a time, clutching the ledger to her chest. Elias was waiting at the bottom. He looked up at her, expression unreadable, and said, "That one belonged to him." Miriam's mouth went dry. To who? The boy didn't blink. The first me. Behind him, the mirror in the hallway shimmered. And somewhere deep within its frame, something laughed low and quiet, like it was remembering the joke before it told it. It was just past dawn when Elias spoke again, voice low and unhurried, as if the words had been waiting inside him for years. Miriam found him in the nursery, sitting on the floor with a line of dolls arranged in a perfect half-circle before him. None of them had faces anymore. Their eyes had been scratched off, their mouths rubbed raw. The mirror in the hallway, half visible through the open door, caught the edge of the scene, reflecting nothing but stillness. "I want a brother," Elias said. His tone was steady, careful, like someone reciting a request they'd been told not to repeat. Miriam didn't answer right away. She moved slowly, knelt beside him, and looked at the mutilated toys. She picked one up, a doll that had once belonged to his mother. The stuffing peeked through a tear in its chest. Its porcelain head had been cracked and re-glued, the smile now crooked, strained. "You miss your mama?" she asked gently. Elias shook his head. "He doesn't. He just wants someone who matches." "Who?" Miriam's voice came out dry. The boy pointed toward the mirror. "Him, the one inside." She followed his gaze. Nothing moved in the glass, no figure, no flicker, only the reflection of the hallway, slanted with morning light. Still, She stood up and walked slowly to the mirror's edge, careful not to look directly into it. "You want a brother like you?" she asked. Elias stood too now, moving beside her. "Not like me," he said. "The same as me. He says if I give him a name, he can stay." Miriam's heart thudded once, then again, louder. "Who says?" The boy tilted his head toward the mirror. "He does." Then Elias pressed his palm to the glass. A moment passed still, quiet. Then the reflection touched back, but not in the way it should have. The mirrored boy's hand was too late, too sharp at the edges, and his nails too long. The smile came next, familiar, too wide. Elias kept his hand there, his expression soft, like a child comforting a pet. "He said names are doors," Elias whispered. "He said I get to choose one, and then he gets to choose what to do next." Miriam pulled him back with both hands, firm but not panicked. She didn't speak, didn't dare. That night, she poured salt along every windowsill, tucked iron nails into the corners of every room, and covered every mirror she could find. But when she entered the parlor, the old sheet lay already folded on the floor. The mirror was bare, and in it stood Elias, only his mouth moved in the reflection. "I've picked one," the mirrored boy whispered. "His name is Hollow." Upstairs, the real Elias slept soundly, hands curled to his chest, like a newborn. But downstairs, the glass pulsed once, like a breath held behind silver. Something had been named, and something had begun. It happened quietly, the way terrible things often do. No scream, no struggle. Just absence sharp and sudden, like something erased with a single stroke. The stable boy, Matthew, had been with the Whitmores since spring, barely older than Elias, but louder, full of jokes and harmless mischief. He'd taken a liking to the boy, often slipping him bits of sweetbread or whispering ghost stories when Thomas wasn't near. Elias never laughed, but he listened, always listened. That morning, Miriam found the front door ajar. The sky was gray with mist, the earth soaked from a night of relentless rain. She called out once, twice, but the only answer was the wind curling through the trees. Thomas was already in the fields. The cook was in the root cellar. No one had seen Matthew since the night before. His cot in the stables was untouched, blankets folded with eerie precision. Miriam searched the yard, her apron hem dragging through mud. That's when she saw them, two boots, placed side by side in front of the parlor mirror. They were Matthew's, caked in dried soil, laces tucked in, soles facing the glass. But what stopped her wasn't the boots. It was the way they pointed toward the mirror, not away, as if he'd stood there, removed them neatly, and stepped inside. The mirror was clean, too clean, no dust, no fingerprints, just a faint ripple at the center, like heat rising from a road. Miriam reached for the boots, but a cold gust rushed past her, a sudden draft with no open window, no broken seal. She backed away, heart stammering. "Elias," she called, louder this time. He appeared from the hallway, calm as ever, eyes unreadable. "Where is Matthew?" she asked. "He went with Hollow," Elias said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no flicker of unease. "He said he wanted to see where the smile comes from." Miriam's throat tightened. "And did he?" Elias looked past her, toward the mirror. "I think so." That night, Thomas searched the property with lanterns, calling the boy's name until his voice went hoarse. They found nothing. No trail, no blood, no goodbye, just the boots. Miriam tried to bury them behind the barn, but the ground refused to hold them. By morning, they were back in front of the mirror, clean now, polished, waiting. She locked the parlor door and prayed. Prayed for the boy, for the house, for whatever pieces of Elias still remained untouched. But in her dreams, she saw Matthew, or something wearing his shape, smiling in the dark, teeth too many, eyes too wide, pressing a hand to the other side of the glass. A hand that looked too thin, too flat, too hollow. And when she woke, there was a single muddy footprint in the hall. Facing the mirror, always facing the mirror. The dog had been restless for days. Old Boone, A hound as grey as chimney ash and blind in one eye had always been gentle. He slept beneath the porch swing, followed Elias around the orchard, and whined at thunder, but never barked at shadows. That changed when the mirror began humming. Not a sound, not exactly, more like a vibration in the air, felt in the teeth, in the ribs, in the way the curtains swayed when there was no breeze. Boone felt it first. He began growling low in his throat whenever Elias came near, ears flattened, tail between his legs. The others dismissed it. Thomas blamed his age. The cook said animals feel storms before they come. But Miriam knew. The hound's hackles rose whenever the boy passed by. His eyes never left the mirror. He would not sleep indoors anymore, would not touch food served from the house. Then, one morning, he vanished. Thomas found him behind the woodpile, curled like he had laid himself down gently. But there was no gentleness in the way. His body twisted, spine arched backward, limbs pulled too tight. His mouth was open, as if caught in a scream, and his tongue was black, black and swollen and stiff. Miriam wept as they buried him under the magnolia tree. Elias didn't weep. He stood by the window, fingers pressed to the glass, watching the ground swallow the only creature that had ever feared him. That night, Miriam found muddy paw prints in the parlor. They led from the mirror and circled the room 3 times. No prints led in. No prints led out. Just a spiral, like something had been pacing, or dancing, or waiting. At dawn, Elias said he wanted to draw Boone. Miriam, unsure if she was more afraid of his silence or his speech, handed him paper and charcoal. He worked at the table for an hour, shoulders stiff, head tilted. When he was done, he held the paper out to her. The sketch was detailed, almost too detailed. Boone, as he had looked in death but mirrored, the twisted spine, the open mouth, the tongue blackened, but everything on the wrong side. The scar above the right eye had become the left. Even the paw turned inward, a backwards dog. He followed Hollow in, Elias said, not looking up. But Hollow wouldn't let him stay. He said Boone remembered too much. Miriam took the drawing and burned it in the fireplace. The ashes floated upward like flakes of soot and memory. The mirror stayed quiet that day. But when she passed it after supper, she caught a shape flicker behind her, a dog's silhouette, just for a second, nose pressed to the glass, tail stiff as a rod. And just before it vanished, she heard a single sound. Not a bark, not a growl, a whimper, the kind a dog makes when it knows it won't be let back inside. It began as a whisper, carried through the seams of the house like wind through cracks in a coffin. Don't look after dark. That was the rule Bess used to mutter under her breath while polishing brass or snapping beans in the kitchen. Miriam had thought it was superstition, like burying iron at crossroads or tying red thread to a cradle. But now, with Boone dead and Matthew gone, the rule felt less like folklore and more like a warning etched too late. The mirror changed after sundown. During the day, it only watched. But at night, it listened. That much Miriam knew. The surface no longer showed simple reflections. After dusk, it grew darker than the room, darker than shadow, and sometimes, when the firelight flickered just right, something behind the glass would move just out of step with the rest of the world. Not reversed, just wrong. She started lighting candles in pairs, one for herself and one for the one watching. She didn't say the name Hollow. She'd stopped saying names altogether. Names were doors. Elias had taught her that. That evening, Miriam stood before the mirror with a sheet in her hands. Her fingers trembled, knuckles gone pale with fear. She knew it wouldn't work. It never stayed covered long. But the ritual made her feel like she still had a say in something. Before she could throw the cloth, she caught a flicker in the glass. Not her reflection. Something else. A child's hand, sliding slowly down the inside of the mirror, dragging along, as if drawing lines in frost. Then came another hand. And then a face Elias's, but grayer, more stretched, the eyes too deep, the mouth trembling with a smile that came a second too early. Miriam dropped the cloth. The reflection froze. It smiled wider. Then everything behind her stilled. The room went unnaturally quiet. Even the fire had stopped crackling. "Don't look after dark," she whispered to herself, backing away. Upstairs, a soft creaking sound began. Footsteps. But they weren't coming from the stairs. They were pacing above her. In the ceiling, in the walls. She ran to Elias's room. He sat cross-legged on the bed, head tilted, eyes distant. "You can't cover it anymore," he said. "He sees, even when it's blind." Miriam grabbed him by the shoulders. "Do not look after sundown, Elias. No matter what you hear, no matter what he says, you stay away." Elias blinked slowly. "But he looks at me." She sat with him until sleep took his bones, his breath soft and even. But downstairs, the mirror pulsed with a dim glow. Not light, but hunger. Not flame, but something deeper. And in the silence that followed, something knocked. Once, twice, then a third time, soft, deliberate, as if asking for someone to look back. Morning came with the kind of stillness that made Miriam's skin crawl. The air felt wrong, too dense, like the house had held its breath all night and now refused to exhale. She lit a candle before stepping into the hallway, though it was already light out. Her hands shook. The air smelled faintly of iron. Elias's door stood slightly ajar. She nudged it open, whispering his name. No reply. The bed was made, perfectly. Not a wrinkle in the sheets. The pillow untouched. The candle by his bedside had burned to the stub, wax frozen mid-drip. She checked the windows. Locked. The wardrobe. Empty. A faint breeze tugged at her skirts. She turned and saw it. The parlor door, open wide. She ran. The mirror stood exposed, taller than ever, the morning light pooling in front of it like spilled milk. But something was wrong. Elias was not there. Not in the room, not in the glass. Yet his reflection remained. It stood still as stone, eyes unblinking, mouth in that now familiar not smile. One hand was raised, pressed flat to the inside of the glass. Waiting. Miriam staggered forward, breath caught between sob and scream. "Elias," she called. Nothing. The boy in the mirror did not move, did not mirror, just stood, an echo with no source. She turned sharply, half expecting him to appear behind her, as he sometimes did. The room was empty. Only the ticking of the long case clock broke the silence. That, and the faint sound of breathing, coming from the glass. She touched the frame. It was warm, too warm, and when she leaned close, she heard something else behind the breath. A hum, a tune, one Elias used to hum when his mother brushed his hair, but it was slower now, off-key, like it had been learned by listening through a wall. "Where is he?" she whispered. The boy inside the mirror blinked. Then, slowly, painfully, its mouth opened, but no words came out. Just the sound of water, dripping, drowning, the same sound they'd heard the night his mother died. Miriam stepped back. The boy's mouth stretched wider, not a scream, a yawn, as though waking up. And then, as she stared, she saw it his shadow, the one in the mirror. It no longer matched his posture. It writhed, slow and serpentine, like something shedding its skin. Miriam turned and ran. She scoured the house, the attic, the cellar, the orchard. No footprints, no torn fabric, no sign of struggle. Only the mirror, standing proud, holding what it had taken. That evening, she locked every door, lit every candle, sat by the mirror with the Bible on her lap and salt in her shoes. But the boy remained inside, watching, smiling, breathing. Elias was gone, but his reflection had stayed. And reflections do not vanish. They wait. The mirror would not break. Miriam tried at dawn, when the house was quiet and the light was soft enough to lie. She came with a hammer wrapped in cloth, hands shaking, salt packed beneath her tongue. She whispered a prayer she only half remembered and raised her arm high. The swing landed squarely at the mirror's heart, a blow meant to shatter the thing to dust. But the glass held. The blow reverberated back into her bones, sending a jolt through her elbow and down her spine. A long, hairline crack split across the floorboards beneath it, but the mirror stood untouched, not even a ripple. It didn't ring or groan. It simply remained. Still, watching, Miriam struck again and again. The hammerhead chipped. Her arms ached. The frame began to hum, not loud, but deep, a vibration in her chest that made her ribs feel brittle. On the third strike, her knees buckled. Her vision blurred, and then she saw it. Her reflection had changed. It still wore her face, her clothes, her posture, but it was not her. Its eyes blinked faster, mouth slightly parted in anticipation. And her hands hung wrong, as if something had forgotten how to hold them. The reflection stepped forward. She had not moved. Its face leaned close to the glass. No breath, no fog. And from behind it, just past the edges of the frame, Miriam saw Elias, or the shape of him. He stood far behind the mirrored version of her, eyes wide, lips stitched tight, not by thread, but by will. His hands beat faintly against something unseen. The mirror. He was inside, still inside. Elias, she whispered, one hand pressed against the surface. The reflection mimicked her movement but delayed, like a puppet struggling to match its master. Then its smile bloomed, sick and giddy. Miriam turned to run, to gather Thomas, to burn the house if need be. But the moment her back was turned, something cracked, not the mirror, but something inside her, a sound low and wet, like a door being pried open from the wrong side. Her arms stiffened, her neck locked, and behind her the mirror pulsed. The reflection stepped closer. She could feel it. Though her body moved toward the door, her shadow stayed behind, frozen, anchored, hollow. That night, the candles would not stay lit. Thomas complained of drafts, of strange dreams, of voices whispering behind the walls. But Miriam said nothing. She moved through the house like a marionette, slower now, face pale as ash, lips stretched in a smile just a little too wide. And in the parlor, the mirror shone smooth and calm. Miriam's reflection blinked once, but she did not. Then it raised its hand, waved, and smiled. The door behind the mirror had always been there, though no one knew it. Not even Thomas, who'd overseen the house's expansion after the war, could recall a room built behind that wall. But Miriam, what was left of her, discovered it late one evening, when the lantern sputtered and the glass fogged not from breath, but from something deeper, like the house itself had exhaled. The mirror shimmered, as if melting, and the wall behind it groaned with the sound of shifting wood. Then came the outline, a rectangular seam in the plaster, faint and long-sealed. She moved closer, arms limp at her sides, fingers twitching with a will not entirely her own. Her eyes didn't blink. She wasn't wearing shoes. The wallpaper peeled away without protest, crumbling at her touch. Behind it, a small brass knob revealed itself, tarnished with age but cold to the touch. She turned it. The panel creaked open, inch by inch, and what lay beyond was not darkness, but stillness. A room no larger than a pantry, with no windows and walls, the color of old bone. The air was cold, too cold, like breath held too long. Inside were objects laid with careful intention. A rocking horse with one missing eye, a cracked basin still damp with something pink, a doll without a mouth, and in the far corner, a tiny bed. On it lay a child-sized suit, folded neatly beside a pair of shoes so small they looked like they'd never been worn. But the worst was the sound, the humming, the tune Elias used to sing before sleep, soft and circular, coming not from the air but from the floor itself. Beneath the bed, scratched into the wooden boards, were dozens of lines, tally marks, some counted in sevens, others crossed out violently. Beside them, a name etched again and again, not Elias, but hollow, sometimes spelled wrong, sometimes spelled backwards, but always there. At the center of the far wall hung a mirror, smaller than the one downstairs, older. The silver behind the glass had begun to rot, black spots blooming like bruises. But in it, Miriam's reflection was clear, too clear. She stepped forward. The reflection did not match. It tilted its head first. It smiled first. Then it opened its mouth. He was born here first, it said, but the world chose the wrong boy. Behind her, the panel door clicked shut. The room did not darken. The mirror grew brighter, and somewhere within the glow, a small voice began to hum again, the same tune, the same rhythm. But the pitch was off deeper now, older, as if the child behind the mirror had been waiting a very long time to be remembered, or worse, to be let out. She brought him out at dusk, or maybe he came on his own. The details no longer settled neatly in Miriam's memory. Time had unraveled in the days since she opened the door behind the mirror. Light lasted too long. Shadows fell where they shouldn't. Sometimes she found herself speaking aloud, only to realize she hadn't opened her mouth. But she remembered the moment clearly, the moment she saw him step from the parlor into the hall. The second Elias. Hollow. The same height, the same curls, the same hands folded neatly in front of him. But there was a difference in the way he moved. A grace too practiced. A stillness too absolute. He didn't blink, not at first, just stood in the hall like a child waiting to be invited in. Thomas saw him too, dropped his glass, staggered back. Where, what in God's name? But Hollow turned to him, that too wide smile curling at the edges, and said, in Elias's voice, "I'm better now." The words were smooth, not forced, not echoed, spoken, whole. Thomas didn't sleep that night, neither did Miriam. Hollow moved through the house like a ghost that had never died. He touched the furniture, walked the orchard path, even dipped his hands in the wash basin like he remembered the water. Elias had been delicate, tentative. This one was precise, certain. At breakfast, he served himself, poured tea, wiped his mouth with a cloth he hadn't reached for. The mirror watched him from the parlor, but Hollow didn't look back. He didn't need to anymore. That night, Miriam followed him. He wandered from room to room, not lost, but checking, testing. He paused at each mirror in the house, tiny ones, dusty ones, even the back of a spoon left on the mantel. He stared into each until his reflection caught up. Then he nodded and moved on. In the nursery, he found Elias's drawings tucked in a drawer. He took one, an image of two boys holding hands, and folded it into a perfect square. He slid it beneath his pillow before climbing into bed. When Miriam leaned in to kiss his forehead, her lips stopped short. The skin was warm, too warm, and pulsing, like something was moving just beneath the surface, learning how to wear the world. She stepped back. "Do you remember what you used to be?" she asked. Hollow opened his eyes. "No," he said, "but I remember what he was." His eyes gleamed sharp, bottomless. "And I'll be better." The mirror downstairs rippled once that night, just once, but the whole house shivered with it. The parlor clock ticked backwards until morning. And on the hearth, a new pair of boots appeared, smaller than Elias's, untouched by dirt. Waiting, Hollow was not pretending anymore. He had passed through. The rehearsal was over. Miriam no longer called him Elias, not aloud, not even in thought. That name had become a husk, a torn page, something too hollow to hold meaning. The boy who now sat at the table each morning, wore the right clothes, blinked at the right times, asked to be excused with the right tone, but everything about him was slightly too perfect, as if learned by study, not by memory. Hollow had learned to cry. That was the worst of it. One afternoon, after the rooster disappeared and Thomas found only feathers beneath the porch, Hollow emerged from the barn with tears in his eyes. Big, clean tears, sliding neatly down his cheeks like someone had shown him a diagram. He said the rooster had flown away. Thomas nodded, relieved. Miriam only watched the way the boy's hand gripped the hem of his shirt too tight, knuckles white. That evening, she crept down the stairs, long after the house had gone quiet. The mirror glowed faintly in the parlor, not with light, but with something older. It was not reflecting anymore. It was showing. The room inside was no longer theirs. The chairs were different. The floorboards stained darker. The walls bore scratches like tally marks. And standing in the middle was the real Elias, or what was left of him. He was thinner now, face drawn, hair limp as moss, mouth stitched closed, not by thread, but by will. His eyes caught hers. He did not blink. He raised a hand and pressed it to the other side of the glass. Miriam stepped forward, matching his hand with her own. The mirror was cold now, cold like stone, cold like something buried. Behind her, floorboards creaked. Hollow stood at the edge of the parlor, silent and barefoot, eyes gleaming like wet marbles. "He can't stay in there forever," he said. "He's already fading." Miriam didn't answer. She couldn't. Hollow walked forward slowly and placed a hand on the opposite side of the mirror. But his touch did not match Elias's. His fingers were longer, too long. The glass trembled where they met. "You can let him go," he whispered, "or I can take the rest of him." The room felt thinner, stretched like cloth over a broken frame. Miriam turned to the fire, to the iron poker resting in its cradle. She grabbed it without thinking, lifted it high, and drove it toward the glass. But the mirror did not shatter. It swallowed the metal whole, pulling it through like water. Hollow smiled. "He tried that too," he said. Upstairs, the candles flickered out one by one. The clock chimed once, then again, then stopped. Miriam fell to her knees. The reflection behind the glass stepped back, so did Hollow, and for the first time, both boys smiled at the same time, perfect, in sync, as if the glass no longer mattered. They sold the house in spring. No notice, no farewell. Just trunks packed at dawn, keys left on the mantel, and a letter slipped beneath the chapel door. Thomas didn't speak much in those final days. His face had gone slack, as if carved from something softer than flesh. Miriam stayed behind one last night, said it was to clean, to bless the place. But really, it was to see what remained. The mirror had been covered in linen, tied tight with butcher's twine, the kind used for animals too large to carry whole. She sat before it on the parlor floor, lantern at her side, the house groaning softly around her. The glass did not move, not this time. There was no pulsing, no reflection, no grin, just stillness. Stillness so deep it felt like breath held in a closed mouth. She thought of Elias. Not Hollow, but the boy who used to press flowers between pages, who asked why thunder sometimes sounded sad, who hummed lullabies without knowing their names. She tried to remember his laugh. Couldn't. Just the sound of him drawing in the dust, or whispering to no one, or asking for a brother. The mirror had taken that voice, but it had left something behind, something that now walked, spoke, breathed. The townsfolk never asked why the new boy never blinked quite right, why he stared at puddles longer than most, why his boots were always too clean. He was polite, helpful, well-behaved. Better, they said. Better than Elias ever was. The family resettled on the other side of the river, in a modest white house, with new glass and no mirrors taller than a child. Hollow smiled often. He liked to help in the garden. He did not dream. But miles away, in a schoolhouse built near the ruins of the old chapel, a teacher noticed something strange. A boy, thin, pale, with curls too neat, sat at the back of the class. She didn't remember enrolling him. He had no last name. Just said Elias. He wrote backwards when no one was looking, and once, during recess, he stood in front of the drinking trough and stared at his reflection for a long time. Another child asked why he was smiling. Elias replied, "Because I'm not in there anymore." The next day, the teacher found her own face drawn on every slate in the room, eyes crossed out, mouth wide open, teeth all wrong. When she blinked, they were gone. Only chalk dust remained. The old Whitmore house stood empty for years. Ivy crept up its bones, storms cracked its windows, but the mirror stayed. No one knew how, and sometimes, on quiet nights, children passing by would swear they saw a figure in the glass, not moving, just smiling, always a second too early. If this story followed you into the dark, like and subscribe to the Black Chapter, where what's buried never stays quiet.